Believe it or not, we're getting toward the latter part of our conversation, but I'd like to step forward from this. So much, you're making clear, so much is at stake as to what happens in the future, depending on what happens now. And I'd like to sort of broaden that back up to the theme of creating the world we want. So you've given us this example. I'd like to go also to, on this show, we've had the opportunity to say, okay, there's a status quo, it gets talked about, it's acceptable, it's what the paper writes about, and it limits what people are allowed to imagine as possible. And yet there's an alternative way of thinking about the economy, about cooperative behavior, about community investment structures. And we need to make really fundamental progress on race and on gender issues. So part of what I'd like to ask is, and we've had several discussions of racism, what do you think is, when I was running for office, I proposed a truth and reconciliation process, a very public discussion all over the state, convened by institutions and advocated by the governor. What is it that you think needs to happen in the larger state so that these questions, which are front and center and yet often not discussed, so that they get discussed and we can make real progress and going to the heart of I don't think solving, but at least being honest and advancing how the questions are not only discussed, but how we interact.
Well, I think there's a couple ways to approach this, and at a recent talk with legal services advocates, my former colleagues, we were talking about storytelling, and we were specifically talking about how in many cases we are dealing with people dealing with multiple layers of oppression. And it really, it hit me, I don't know, years ago, but it really began to formulate my understanding, why am I so frustrated with not even the right and their lack of discussion of race. It's more the left who isn't getting it right. And it's worse because the left is wrapping itself, and progressives are wrapping themselves in how they want to deal with racism. And when you do that and then also don't implement and don't know what you're doing, you actually make that situation worse. So I've said this, and I don't mean to sound so controversial, but I think the fourth level, or the next movement for civil rights and race dialogue, is for my incredible, dedicated colleagues who also identify as white to turn and organize white people. Love that they want to be allies and be in spaces for racial justice where they're predominantly people of color. But I said I note an irony that some of my friends who will go out of their way to become racially competent and learn Spanish and to organize with Latinos at the border cannot turn around and tell her Republican father why he shouldn't vote for Trump. They could not organize other white people. So I don't think that the step really is about having more racial talks amongst people of color, because those talks are important, but it's the same people show up all the time to them. People who get it or people who think they get it. The issue is if there's an advantage and a natural affiliation that race is bringing, it is for white folks to talk to other white folks about racism in a real way. And that organizing is not happening. I am finding overwhelmingly really incredible, smart racial justice warriors who are white insist on being in communities of color. And
being in as in going to meetings or
meetings, organizing, working in the organizations, or running these organizations. And that is not a bad thing, but if you do that without being able to organize in Newton, or in Brookline, or in Weston, or in Sudbury, where a majority of Massachusetts residents live, not in communities of color, they live in the suburbs around other white folks. If you're not able to organize your own community, then I think you need to recognize your limitations about coming into somebody else's.
Very, very quick story from my spending a lot of time in South Africa and writing about South Africa, is that there were these interracial, diverse organizing groups. One of a student group called the National Union of Students Against in South Africa, NUSAS. Anyway, they were supposed to be allies and so forth, but white students tended at running all of them and taking the front and assuming that they had the natural leadership role. And there was a massive split at one point where they created the South African Students Organization, which was entirely black, and built the Black Consciousness Movement, which is directly related to Black Power in Massachusetts and United States. So there was a decision, a rupture that said, we cannot be free. All of us can't be free unless the white folks step back and black young people exercise the leadership, and the whites focus on the things they can really get done, which is in their own communities. So I'm just saying there was a precedent
I want to be clear.
35 years
it's not
ago.
Stepping back that I'm asking white folks to do. I'm asking white folks to step up in their own communities, and instead I find that a lot of them just would rather organize and work with communities of color, and that's okay, but it doesn't change anything.
Why do you think that is? I mean, what's the motivation that you sense from?
I don't know. You have to ask a white person.
Yeah. And on gender issues, where do we need to make? I mean, you've been right at the center of driving change on the council and on many other ways. But again, we're looking, both of us, for like, what are the breakthrough things? What are the things that don't get talked about that could really make? And that's not to take away from all of the step-by-step regulations and laws to guarantee equality, but at a kind of cultural, a political consciousness level, what needs to happen?
I think in many cases there needs to be we have been, I'll say, there's opportunities that I've certainly experienced that my mother never did, and other women and other generations have never been able to have. I think what we really need to see again is not a stepping back or a shutting up, but a stepping up of men. I think women have proven that we can or have to handle being the breadwinner, being the comforter, being the house cleaner, being all things in a household, and there's that additional tax of literally working 9 to 5 and then another 24 hours, as even when they are married. And have a male partner. So what I have not seen, and I don't see enough of, is the intergenerational growth of men to step up into those spaces that are considered quote unquote domestic or women's work, and men being able to show that they can handle that as well, lighten the burden, and they are not less of men because they are staying at home, taking care of the children, being caretakers to their parents, and doing that work as well, uncompensated. There needs to be a push from men organizing men about gender equality, for their own mental health, for their own emotional health, for their own ability to be great fathers. And that, I think, when it comes to gender equity, women aren't confused about where we're oppressed or what solutions we need. Men are.
From my perspective, these deep, entrenched, long-term problem solving require a cultural shift, really, to, as you said, like whether it's issues of race or stepping up for women from the men's perspective. We need a cultural shift, and I think a lot of that.
I just want to correct. I didn't say step up for women, right? I need men to step up.
Period.
Right.
Yeah, so my bad. The framing was off there. Don't want to be little. But from a cultural shift, I feel like a lot of this has to do with the media not necessarily discussing it on an everyday basis. The stories we're being told in the media are short-term, sensationalist, profit-seeking, really.
Yeah.
Why do you think the current media paradigm is set up like that instead of long-term problem-solving and really getting at the structural issues in society? Why don't you think the media is actively covering that? And do you have any suggestions on how we can integrate that more into our society to hopefully see this cultural shift?
Well, the media is doing what every other corporation is doing, and that's making a profit. So it's not a bad, or like where they're consciously not doing something, they are consciously operating in a capitalist society to make money. And as you said, they need clickbait to make money. Ratings make money. They can sell commercial space if people are watching you. So the goal is to make money, not to highlight news. So that's our current media system. And because of the conglomeration of so many media outlets, under a larger corporate structure, it becomes harder and harder for local news to just really talk about local issues because they're not clickbait. Conversations are not clickbait. They require work, they require time to sit and listen. And so that is, I think, one of the biggest issues is breaking up the bigger and larger media conglomerates and saying we need to separate this for our democracy's sake, providing free, more public access television, providing access in our classrooms and making that almost a part of our civic engagement. I think that having access, it's expensive to be on TV if you want to be in politics or to get a message out there. And it shouldn't be that expensive if you're going to talk about certain things. I think, providing for free, there's campaign finance reform that we should look at so that people aren't spending their time feeding the beast of a capitalist media market. So then now I have to give you the clickbait that you will try and sell as a politician so that I can get my commercial on there, right? So that's the kind of thing that, we feed the beast by buying into that commercial market. And the beast is really just the same capitalist structure. We just allow our media to do it. So I don't think it's a criticism of anything except that you need to provide free, equitable outlets for media that I think people will watch. I think they will be competitive. I think there are more people looking for, fair and deeper conversations.
I agree.
That's partly what we're trying to do here, and it's a effort in progress. Just to wrap up, two things. And you can think about them separately together. We spoke briefly and you commented on the turmoil as the Democratic Party tries to figure out whether it should be moderate parties seeking to win back disaffected white men or moderates in some sense, or whether it should be a party of deep structural change calling the question and moving forward. And you have seen the challenges of that at the national level and at the state level. That's question one. Question two is, as we wrap up, I think everybody who listens to this show, watches this show, really is interested in how do we create the world we want? How do we move forward? And so, relating it to the first question, and how do we push the Democratic Party? How do we wake people up? So those are two very specific things that I know you care about.
I think the Democratic Party needs to decide how, if it wants to win, period. I don't think in this society, you will win without movement. And so the Democratic Party needs to decide what message will create a movement. And it hasn't decided yet. I genuinely feel it hasn't decided if it wants to win and if it wants how it's going to create that movement and be honest about that. What we have decided in many cases is that we are no longer going to be silent and for the sake of certain things. And I think actually, arguing that if we don't win or if we don't produce a certain kind of candidate, we won't beat Trump is a false starter for a lot of folks. A lot of folks have been like, well, it's been 4 years, I survived it. I've survived Trump. So they're not frightened of that anymore. That's not good enough to tell me that he's been such a horrible president. I know that. It's not good enough to say that he'll do horrible things.
Horrible stuff.
I know that. And
so what is good enough?
That there's a world worth fighting for. There's a movement that it can be achieved if we tried. And really getting people to believe that people can work 40 hours and pay rent, that they can make a decent salary, that we can we will not be able to solve all of the isms that we have in society, but that we're committed to lessening them in our systems and creating systems that don't have those same god-awful outputs as before. I think that telling folks, quite honestly, that, the world that you want for your children, right, in order to get to that world, these certain structural things need to change, and we can actually change that. And I think a lot of people just don't think we can. They have an assumption that capitalism is, the way it's structured right now, is a natural thing. There is nothing against it. And I'm not against a market society where you need to produce good products and people need to buy them and you need to demonstrate that your product is worth purchasing, and I don't mind competition in that market society. But what we've created is a society overwhelmingly based on people who invest but don't work, and then make all of the profit from that investment at the expense of the workers getting paid 1 cent a day or whatever it is in third world countries. That is not natural. That is oppression on steroids and brought to scale. We should bring market-based, just societies to scale, and telling people that we can do that without being so wonky and so to the left, without feeling that you need to carry this message into a community of color. If you're white, that isn't who needs to hear it. It's your friends and families in the suburbs who work for a lot of these corporations. They need to hear that. And so I think it's really, the party needs to decide, is it worth the soul of our party? I think if we go, you need bold leadership, you need a bold message to take on this president. And I don't think a centrist or a moderate is going to be bold. That's literally the opposite of the word centrist and moderate, is boldness and taking a risk. And so if the Democratic Party needs to make a decision if it's going to win and how it's going to create a movement, and I don't know how you do that, being in the middle and being lukewarm.
I'm just going to pick up the one phrase you said, and maybe we can wrap up on this. But you said it's going to require being bold, taking risk. And I think that what I'm hearing as conversations we've had is that part of creating the world we want is that we have to be bold. We can't say, oh, I love that idea and hope it comes into being. You have to engage. What other advice would you have for the people who have started listening to this on a regular basis? How do we create the world we want?
Well, I think you support with your money and your voice and your clicks. Small businesses, small movements, local movements that are already doing the work. In many cases, people get inspired and they become a Facebook warrior, and they think somehow retweeting or reposting or getting in back and forth online is actually making a change. And instead, people have just really become their own self-promoters. You need to go buy at the local co-op then. You need to go find the company that is hiring folks who are returning citizens from jail, from prisons. You need to support the child care co-op and invest in a local co-op that's doing a direct public offering. You need to find places to invest in that are already doing the work. And not just simply say what's wrong with society. I don't believe for 1 second we don't have models, we don't have the creativity, we don't have people struggling to make it work. We just, in many cases, don't have the masses behind that struggle. So that's an immediate thing people can do, and they just go on to, I think it's the United Federation for Worker Co-ops, and they have a list nationwide of those co-ops trying to do right by their workers. If we don't support them with our dollars, then what we're saying is, no, we don't actually believe in change. We won't support it. So why would I bother to engage in change if that means ultimately when I turn to look to my left and right, my friends, family, and consumers aren't there? We've done it, we've seen it work, divestment with environmental products. So we need to do the same thing when it comes to different economic structures. Support those, like at Jackson, Mississippi, and the models that they've come up with. Support land trusts, support all of these different things in a massive way. And corporations will just go where the money goes. So if the money is going into a solidarity economy, they will come marching along. They'll try and take it some way, but they'll go there. And I think that's what we need to understand. Our money, our time, our effort, our hearts aren't for sale. You should put them and invest them in places that are doing the right thing.
This is beautiful. I mean, this concept of living democracy is really inspiring to hear, and I think it's shown through our shows here. And I just wanted to ask one last question: is what can our community help you do for the second half of 2019? What are you excited about that we can devote our energy to helping your causes?
Well, please stay involved and comment on Suffolk Downs. We produced almost 60 pages of public comment just from my office. on Suffolk Downs and looking at the housing and looking at all the ways in which we felt it could be a more just neighborhood. And I think the intentionality about creating a neighborhood needs to be a theme that everyone is demanding for Suffolk Downs. I think we also need to look at, the zoning amendment. We propose a zoning amendment that actually infuses civil rights into the zoning code. So to further fair housing is actually a mandate from the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And it literally says to remove obstacles to opportunities. Mm-hmm. It is not enough just not to discriminate anymore. Like, we just won't have the sign up that says no black people. That's where a lot of people stop with understanding of discrimination and fair housing. This is actually saying a mandate. You need to remove the obstacles. You cannot allow for concentrations of poverty or wealth. You need to look at the surrounding neighborhoods and making sure that there's an integration and pathway into the middle class, into housing. That's actually from the Fair Housing Act. And so to take that language, we are proposing a zoning amendment and putting that into the Boston zoning code. And so we hope to have a hearing about that. But it shouldn't just be Boston leading on that. It should be other cities where there's a zoning code and demanding that when you plan with intentionality. You plan looking at the racial dynamics, looking at the class issues, looking at the jobs that are available and not available, and that you take that into account when you're looking at the housing stock that you're going to create. Too many times we leave the planning over here and say somehow it's race neutral. History has demonstrated that planning is the biggest segregator in housing, that we have intentionally planned with racial covenants, with redlining from the federal government. We planned this, we created this, so that should be inspiring people to know that we can get our way out of this. Our hands did this, our hands can undo this. But we need to be intentional about it and say it. Our hands will do this. And that's, I think, where I would love to have the help of the community, is to constantly say, get your way out of this, Boston lead, do what you want to be the cradle of liberty, be the real cradle for liberty for all, and move and push and demand more from the table in the room where it happens, not just when you're advertising and not discriminating for the housing units, or not just when we're talking about having the NAACP come here for a convention. No, we need to be intentional from day one.
Well, I can't thank you enough for coming and for talking about so many important things. I'd just like to share that your election has done something really extraordinary, which we need even more of, which is that not only are you a person with strong skills and passion and so forth, but you also carry with you a pretty comprehensive vision of how we could be doing things. I ran the New Economy Coalition, where there are so many ideas out there, and yet very often those ideas are overlooked. Public officials aren't aware of them. So the thought that you're bringing this dynamism along with this sophistication about all of these models that are out there and that could be applied is extremely exciting. So I want to thank you. I hope this won't be the last time you join us. I think you've also generated a whole bunch of topics that we may want to organize shows around, move away from the single interview and perhaps focus on some topics. So good luck. Thank you for spending the time. And we feel this is exactly the kind of conversation that we've been trying to have, and I appreciate your presence.
Thank you.
Truly, for diving deeper, it's an honor to discuss these things and just listen to articulate them so well. Thank you.
Thank you.
We want to thank our audience out there for listening in, for tuning in, for watching. We want to thank the Cambridge Innovation here at 50 Milk Street, CIC Boston, because their ambition is to fix the world through innovation. So we're really lucky to be able to use this beautiful space as our home base, which is awesome. We want to be able to keep listening to you and the issues you care about out there. So make sure to reach out to us, go to our website, creatingtheworldwewant.org, listen to us on iTunes and Spotify. Let us know if there's a guest you think really aligns with our values here that we can dive deeper with, because in solidarity, we want to create the world together with you. Thank you very much for your time.